Good evening, and welcome to the Safe Food Handling webinar presented by the Concordia Language Village's Professional Development Team. My name is Mark Chen. I'm one of the group directors, and on behalf of the organization, I'd like to welcome you and thank you for joining us this evening. Before I turn things over to our presenter, Mitch Eichmann, I'd like to take a moment to orient you to the features of this evening's webinar. If you haven't already, please take a moment to mute the microphone on your computer or your telephone, and that will help to maximize the sound quality for everybody who's participating in this evening's webinar. At the end of this evening's webinar, if there's time at the end, Mitch will ask you to unmute your microphones and you'll have an opportunity to ask any questions you might have. Otherwise, throughout the webinar, please feel free to use the question function, and I'll monitor that chat box and periodically ask Mitch your questions at appropriate times. You'll also notice that there's a chat function on the webinar. We're not using the chat function this evening. Finally, just a reminder that this evening's webinar is being recorded and will be posted later for those who are unable to join us live this evening. All right, so it is my pleasure to introduce this evening's presenter. Mitch Eichmann is a certified executive chef with 11 years of experience in the food industry. His professional credits include 5 years of restaurant management, 2 years in franchise business consulting, and has worked for the last 4 years under Chef Dan Eastman at Concordia Language Villages. Mitch makes his home in Bemidji, Minnesota with his wife, 2 kids, and according to Mitch, has 0 Michelin stars. Thanks, Mitch, and I'll turn things over to you.
Thanks, Kenji. Thanks, everybody, for being here. Please be patient with me. This is my first webinar, so I hope not to screw up too bad. We're going to start with a poll, and we're just going to ask if your primary job responsibility this summer will be in culinary arts or with counseling teaching. And so, awesome. Oh, there are a couple counselors here. That's fantastic. Awesome. So next we have a decent mix of culinary arts and counseling and other. That's fantastic. Thank you. So this is a presentation that we give at orientation every summer, and so this is kind of a new version of it. We're going to talk about how to serve safe food to the villagers and to the staff, and to do our best not to make anyone sick. So we're going to, uh-oh, I broke it already. There we go. First thing we're going to talk about is some statistics about foodborne illnesses and the different types of foodborne illness. And then we'll get into the microbiological hazards, which is the largest group of foodborne illnesses. Then we're going to talk about the temperature danger zone and how we can minimize the danger. And we're going to talk about some other types of hazards that are in the food. So let's start with some CDC statistics that say roughly 48 million Americans get sick, and 128,000 are hospitalized, and 3,000 people die of foodborne diseases every year. Obviously, nobody from in the food service industry sets out and wakes up that morning and says, I'm going to make somebody sick today. That's my goal. But we know that they do happen, and so we do our best to prevent those things. And you can see over here on the left that norovirus is the highest percentage, causes the highest percentage of illnesses as far as the total amount of foodborne illnesses go. So we're going to start with the assumption that the wholesale food industry lacks the food safety assurance and exercises little control over the hazards in food. Essentially, we can't trust that our vendors, Cisco, Reinhardt, US Foods, prevent hazards from getting into the food. And so we have to assume that it is potentially hazardous and that hazards are always present in that food. There are 3 different types of hazards that you will find in food. You will find microbiological hazards. There's 4 different kinds of those. There's bacteria, viruses, just like we talked about with the norovirus, parasites, which are going to be worms, and then there's molds and yeasts. And so you've all probably seen moldy bread on your counter and you toss that right away. And you've all probably seen some moldy cheese and eaten it. And so molds and yeast is an interesting one to get into. You will also find chemical hazards in your food, pesticides and cleaning chemicals in the food. If you spill cleaning chemicals in the food or just pesticides from farming. And you can also find physical hazards in the food, such as hair.
My name is Burt Macklin. I'm with the FBI.
And so the first thing was the types of hazards, and now this is the 3 types of foodborne illness. And so those hazards cause the illnesses. We have food infection and food intoxication, which are both caused by those microbiological hazards. And then we have food poisoning, which is caused by those chemical and those physical hazards. So let's get into food infection. So when you go to a restaurant and you come home sick and the next day you have some stomach problems, that is actually a food infection. It is not food poisoning. So food infection is the illness that occurs as a result of consuming living pathogenic microorganisms that then multiply in the body. Some examples are hepatitis A, salmonella, and proper cooking inactivates these pathogens and makes the food safe to eat. We'll get into proper cooking temperatures later. But this is a common misconception when people say they got food poisoning. Most likely they didn't, they actually had a food infection. Food intoxication is caused by consuming toxins produced by bacteria when they multiply in food. So when bacteria multiplies, certain types of bacteria produce toxins, and those toxins may or may not be harmful to your body. Botulinum is one of those toxins. And then cooking does not destroy these toxins. So if these toxins do end up in your food, no matter how much you cook it, it will not go away. If you cook it to the point of ash, where it's nice little black dust, then you have probably inactivated or killed those toxins. But at that point, it's not food; it's ash, and that's not fun to serve or eat. Food poisoning, illness resulting from eating substances or compounds that the body cannot detoxify. Some mushrooms are poisonous. Cleaning and sanitizing chemicals, that's why you're taught not to drink bleach, for example. Sulfates, some people are allergic to sulfates and lead, and so hopefully your pencils, your number 2 pencils don't have lead anymore in them. They've got graphite. And cooking has no effect on poisons. So again, no matter how much you cook it, these poisons will not go away. Somebody will end up getting sick. So back in the beginning, we talked about the 3 types of hazards: microbiological, chemical, and physical. So we're going to delve into the microbiological hazards. And so here's a random question, and Kenji can launch the next poll. But the question is, you get to choose one. I give you $1 billion right now, or I'll give you $1 on January 1st and double your money every day until January 31st. And we're going to wait and see what people say, I think. Interesting. We'll get to the actual answer later. 93% 3% of you think that we should wait the 31 days. So the first type of microbiological hazard is bacteria. If you've had high school chemistry, or high school biology, you've probably learned about bacteria. It's a single-celled organism. Of the microscopic organisms, it is the smallest. It can multiply rapidly. It multiplies by dividing. And some bacteria can form spores, and some bacteria can form toxins. And we know that bacteria reproduce by binary fission or just splitting themselves in half. Next is viruses. A virus is different than bacteria. A virus is a genetic material that's wrapped up in protein. And viruses are transmitted by potentially hazardous food and also just by people. Sneezing into your hand and then opening a door and somebody else opens the door. They do not multiply in food. And foodborne illness from viruses is caused by poor personal hygiene and cross-contamination, which are both things that we can control. And so we'll get into that a little bit later as well on how we control our personal hygiene and cross-contamination. So the third type of microbiological hazard is a parasite. A parasite is a small or microscopic creature that needs a host to reproduce. Thorough cooking kills the larvae. And so again, proper cooking will get rid of and will kill these things. And that's how we avoid spreading parasites. The last type of microbiological hazard is molds and yeasts. Good general rule for mold: if it's not a natural part of the food, toss it. You can freeze mold, and that will stop it growing, but it doesn't kill it. And most molds are killed by heating foods to at least 140 degrees. But molds can produce toxins, and the toxins are not killed by heat. And molds mostly affect the quality of food. Yeast can be recognized by bubbles or an alcohol smell, and they spoil the quality of food. In general, if it smells like yeast and it's not supposed to, throw it away. Yeah. So the answer to our question of today, you all got it right. Well, 93% of you got it right. There we go. If you wait the 31 days, you will end up with $2.1 billion. And when you put this into the context of bacteria, in ideal conditions, bacteria doubles every 20 minutes. And so 31 20-minute increments is 10 hours and 20 minutes. And so if you think about leaving something on the counter overnight, and you got the kitchen closed up at 10 p.m., and you come back in at 7 a.m. the next morning, you have gone 9 hours. And so you're getting pretty close to that 10-hour line, and you've got almost 1 billion bacteria in that food at that point, at least. So just a good illustration of how fast bacteria actually does multiply. So we've talked about the different types of hazards. We've gotten into microbiological hazards and why they can be dangerous. And now we're going to get into the temperature danger zone, and we're going to talk about proper cooking temperatures. And these are things that will be repeated to you over and over and over again, and eventually we hope that you memorize them. That's the longest audio clip in the whole presentation, I promise. Before we get into this, Kenji, can you launch the third poll? And this poll is asking if this is your first year in the kitchen, in the culinary arts department, or if it's after your first year, if you're a returning staff member. Fantastic. Wow. 38% of people are returning staff members. That's great. So the food temperature danger zone is 41 to 140 degrees. This is the temperature in which bacteria multiplies best. Bacteria growth does not stop above or below that temperature. It slows down eventually to the point of freezing, in which you could stop bacteria growth. But below 41 degrees, all the way down to freezing, bacteria growth does not stop. It just slows down long enough for us to be able to use the food. The old wording for dangerous food was potentially hazardous food. The new wording for potentially hazardous food is called TCS foods. This stands for time and temperature control for safety. So I'm going to refer to TCS foods throughout the rest of the presentation, and we're talking about food that needs to be time and temperature controlled for safety. They cannot be in the temperature danger zone for more than 4 hours. Here is the temperatures that we want you to remember. Your freezer should always be at 0 degrees or below. Anything in the freezer we want to be rock solid so that you can knock on it with your, like you're knocking on a door. And so every freezer has a little digital temperature gauge on the outside of it. Anytime you walk past it, it's great to just look up and see what the temperature is. And if it's above 0, then talk to your chef and they can take care of it if it needs to be taken care of. 40 degrees or 41 degrees is the temperature that we want your walk-in coolers to be at. So anytime you walk past your walk-in cooler, just stick your head up and take a look at the temperature gauge. And if it's above 40 degrees, I say 40 degrees just to be a little bit more safe, I guess. But if it's above 41 degrees, especially, tell your chef, and then they can decide if that's something that they need to be concerned about. If you just got a delivery and you've been in and out of the cooler putting your delivery away, it's probably going to be above 41 degrees, and you give it a little bit of time to get back down. But if you walk in right away in the morning and your cooler is at 45 degrees, that's a problem that you need to tell somebody, because we don't know how long that food sat at 45 degrees. It could have been all night long. And so that's something that somebody would need to know right away. The top of the temperature danger zone is 140 degrees, and so we're talking about the minimum hot holding temperature. So if you cook some food, like you're frying some chicken breasts in a tilt skillet, and then you turn around and you stick them in the hot well to hold them so you can fry some more chicken breasts, because at Spanish Bemidji, you're going to be frying 270 chicken breasts, and there's no way they all fit in the tilt skillet all at once. So you're going to have to do it in stages. The chicken breasts that are in that hot well need to be at least 140 degrees as a hot holding temperature. The chicken itself, we'll get to in just a second, needs to be 165 once it's at peak cooking, and then after it hits 165, it can come back down, but it has to stay at least above 140 degrees. After that, we have this kind of trio of temperatures: 145, 155, and 165. 145, and the most common things that you're going to serve in your kitchen: fish, commercially raised game, eggs, scrambled eggs. Those things need to be served to 100, need to be cooked to 145 degrees. The meat is in there as a reminder of things like roasts or medium rare steak. Those things, medium rare as a temperature is 115, 120 degrees. And so if you go to a steakhouse and order your steak medium rare, it's not going to be cooked to 145. It'll be cooked to 120, 125. And per the food code, that is allowable if the customer requests it. We do not cook any meats any less than medium in our kitchens. So we do not do that. But in the restaurants that you go to, that you can order your burger medium or medium rare or your steak, they do fall below this 145, and that's allowable because you requested it. So 145 generally is fish and eggs. And if you are able to get some commercially raised game like reindeer or elk or venison, that has to be 145. 155 is going to be any ground or chopped meat. Ratites, and if anybody knows what a ratite is, feel good. A ratite would be an ostrich in that family of birds, ratites, I guess. 155 is also injected or tenderized meats. And so if your pork loin has been injected with saline, then it needs to be cooked to 155, not 145. And then 165 is going to be your poultry, your chicken, your turkey. Leftovers at the language villages. Leftovers we reheat once. So we heat it up and we serve it the first time we cook it, and then we reheat it again and serve it a second time as leftovers. And then if the kids don't eat it the second time, they're probably not going to eat it the third time. So after the second time we serve something, we throw it away. But all leftovers have to be heated up to 165 degrees. Any wild game that you serve would need to be cooked to 165 degrees. And then stuffed stuff. So if you butterfly chicken breast and stuff it with some cheese and onions, that would be something that's stuffed. And that would need to be cooked to 165. Chicken's not a great example because it already needs to be cooked to 165. So if you had a pork loin and you cut it so you could roll it out and then you roll it up, that would be stuffed. And that would need to be cooked to 165. Calzone is a stuffed stuff. Calzones have to be cooked to 165. And then all the way there at the top is 180 degrees. Dishes are sanitized when their surface temperature reaches 171 degrees. And so we want our dishwashers to reach 180 in order to ensure that our dishes has reached that 171 level. And so anytime you're doing a load of dishes and you get the chance to look down at the rinse cycle, there's a big display on the outside of the dishwasher that'll tell you the temperature. And we want that temperature to be 180 degrees. If it's not, those dishes are not considered clean and you got to wash them again. So to review, we've got the freezer at 0 degrees. We've got the maximum cold holding temperature, which is going to be your cooler at 41 degrees. Minimum hot holding temperature, so all the stuff in your hot well that you're waiting until service needs to be at least 140. And then you've got this trio of temperatures, 145, 155, and 165. 145 is your fish and your eggs and your whole muscle meats. So your roasts, your pork loins. 155 is your ground up or chopped meat. Bacon is considered a 155 meat. And then injected or tenderized meats, and so you have to pay attention to your pork loins. And then 165 is your poultry and your stuffed stuff and your leftovers. And we'll do it all again this summer when you show up. And so we're going to talk about bacteria. We talked about the 3 types of hazards: microbiological, chemical, and physical. Microbiological hazards are bacteria, viruses, molds and yeasts and parasites, and we talk a lot about bacteria because that causes the most foodborne illness. It's caused by bacteria. And so when you're thinking about bacteria growth depends on 3 things, or 6 things. We remember those 6 things by remembering Fat Tom, and I like to picture Tom the cat and Jerry the mouse when I think of Fat Tom, so that's why that's there. The first thing, the F, is food. That's backwards. That's not supposed to do that. Bacteria needs food to grow. Generally, bacteria grows with protein. And so we know that meats grow bacteria on them quickly. But bacteria also grows on vegetables, which don't have a whole lot of protein in them. But bacteria needs food to grow. Bacteria also needs a certain level of acidity to grow. So pickled items do not grow bacteria because the acidity level is too high, and bacteria cannot grow in those conditions. Time. Bacteria needs time in order to grow. Temperature. Bacteria needs to be in the temperature danger zone in order to grow, and so we talk about how to control that. Oxygen. Just like most things, bacteria needs oxygen. Some bacteria doesn't need oxygen, but we'll talk about that in a second. And moisture. Bacteria needs moisture to grow, which is why Beef jerky, or cow raisins, as some people call them, does not grow bacteria on it, or flour, or anything like that. It's just too dry, and bacteria cannot grow if it's too dry. So of these things, there's things that we can control. We could control the food that we're serving people. We could feed them only vegetables, but that wouldn't be super great as far as cultural authenticity is concerned, and it doesn't really solve the problem because bacteria grows on vegetables eventually. Acidity, we could pickle all the food we serve to villagers and just open up the jar and feed it to them, and we'd never have to be worried about bacteria growth. I think that they would probably get kind of tired of pickled items after a week or so. Time is something that we can control. We can control how long our food is in the temperature danger zone, which leads to temperature. Temperature is also something we can control. We can control the temperature of the cooler. We can control the temperature at which we cook food to. We can control the temperature of our food. We can't really control whether our food touches oxygen, and ultimately it doesn't matter because there is aerobic and anaerobic bacteria that grows. Botulinum is one of those things that grows in a non-oxygen environment, which is why if your canned food is ever bulging, you just throw it away. And moisture. We could serve the villagers all dry food. We could serve them beef jerky and dried fruit all summer long, but that's not super cultural authentic. And so we can't do anything about that. So of these things, the two things that we have control over are time and temperature. And that's how we control the growth of bacteria and try to limit illness in our campers. And staff. Staff are important too. And so here's some of the other things that we can control as well as time and temperature. We have time and temperature. We can control our own personal hygiene. We can also control the cleanliness and sanitation of our work areas. And we can control cross-contamination. We'll get into that in a second. We're going to start with time and temperature. We can control how long food is in the danger zone. Your freezer needs to be at 0. Make sure you close the door. Cooler needs to be at 41 or lower. Make sure you close the door. FIFO is called first in, first out. This has to do with making sure that you're using the oldest product first. So if you get 4 cases of milk on Monday and then you get 3 more cases of milk on Wednesday, when you're putting that in the cooler, it's enticing to just throw those 3 cases on top of the case and a half of milk that are left, because that's easy and you don't have to move all that extra milk. It's kind of a pain and it takes time and you just want to get it done, and you're worried about the cooler getting too hot because the door is open. But it's more important that the stuff that was in the cooler or the stuff that was on the shelf first gets served first. Otherwise, we just waste food and we put villagers in danger. When you're labeling food, we need the item name, the date that it was made, and any allergens that are present. There's 8 allergens that cause over 90% of allergic reactions in food. And we will talk about those 8 allergens when you get here this summer. But those are things that we need to label on our stuff that we put in the cooler. And then some village chefs will have you put your initials on those things so that we know who to talk to about what is in that thing if we have any questions. As far as time and temperature goes, we talk about thawing food. There's 4 legal ways to thaw your food. You can thaw your food in the cooler, which is by far the most efficient and best way to do it, and the way that we want everybody to thaw everything all the time. That requires you to look ahead at the menu and say, hey, we're going to have pork loin on Wednesday, and today is Monday, and pork loin comes in these big 10-pound logs, so we should probably pull those out today so that they're thawed out by Wednesday so we can cook them properly. Or if you're making meatballs and you forget to pull out the 30 pounds of ground beef before the day you're supposed to make meatballs, it's hard to make meatballs with frozen ground beef. That one comes from experience. You can thaw food submerged under cold running water. So the law states that the water has to be below 70 degrees and it has to be running to the point where the water doesn't look stagnant. But the products have to be submerged. So this is the backup way of thawing meats in the Concordia kitchens, and you will sometimes see big 5-gallon buckets sitting in a sink with a couple of 10-pound logs of ground beef in them and the water running over them just to get them thawed out in time. This is extremely inefficient. It puts extra wear and tear on our pumps. It puts extra wear and tear on our septic systems, and it's not the best way to do it. It is the second most commonly used way in case we forget something, but we do our best to not forget things. You can thaw things as part of the cooking process. And so this pertains to food that we may have that's cooked from frozen, like some scones that we buy. You are instructed to put those on the baking sheet and put them right in the oven. And so during that baking process, they thaw and then bake. And we just don't think of it that way. We think of it as baking the scones. But they are actually thawing as part of that cooking process. And then number 4 is you thawing something in the microwave and then immediately cooking it. And this works well in a restaurant. If you forget something and you've got one order of it, you can thaw it out in the microwave and cook it, and that works great because it's just one person and one plate. Most microwaves are not big enough to fit the 10-pound logs of ground beef or the pork loin or the 18-pound ham that you're serving for the Christmas dinner. And so those things aren't able to be thawed out in the microwave. We have to use the cooler. We have to put them in the cooler ahead of time. But those are the 4 legal ways to thaw food. Any other way to thaw food besides that is not legal, such as putting your logs of ground beef on a dish rack and putting them in the dishwasher because the dishwasher is hot, right? That is not a legal way to thaw food. We don't want you to do that. Again, that comes from experience. I've seen it done. More time and temperature control, maintaining proper temperatures during preparation. And so if you're cooking at a big camp and you need to do 50 pounds of pork loin and you have to cut them into pork chops, there's really no reason for you to get all 50 pounds of that pork loin out all at once. You could do it in 20-pound increments. You could even do it in 10-pound increments. But the more you have out, the longer it's going to sit out and the longer it spends in the temperature danger zone. You can pre-chill your ingredients. And so if you're making a pasta salad, it works well to do it a little bit ahead of time and then get the pasta into the cooler to cool off. And then the next big substance that's in a lot of pasta salads is mayonnaise. And so if the mayonnaise that you're going to use is also cold, then your pasta salad will stay cold, or it will get down to 40 degrees faster than it would if you used warm ingredients. Prepare as close to serving time as possible. Sometimes this happens by choice. Sometimes we forget about things. Sometimes we're just in a hurry. But one way to keep things out of the temperature danger zone is to prepare them as close to serving time as possible. So if mealtime is at 6, there's really no reason for you to fry those chicken breasts at 4 o'clock and let them sit in the hot well for 2 hours. You could wait until 5 or 5:15 to start that process. And then there's some rules about how we cool hot items. And so if you've seen a hotel pan, this makes sense. If you haven't seen a hotel pan, it will make sense this summer. But a hotel pan is 4 inches deep. And if you put 2 inches of food or less in a hotel pan, it will cool. You can take your hot food and you can put it right in the fridge, wrap it up and put it in the fridge, and it will cool down in the proper amount of time. If you got some leftover soup, it has to be in 1 gallon or less containers. And so putting your leftover soup into one of those big 5-gallon things and sticking that in the fridge is not a proper way to cool that soup. You can also use cold water or an ice bath. And so if you took that 5-gallon bucket of soup and you placed it in an ice bath, and then you stood over it and stirred it and distributed the heat out of it, that would be an okay way to do that. And to do that in a 5-gallon container, but it requires you to stand there and stir it. And another way that we control this is we only heat our leftovers once. Every time you reheat and cool down a food, it's in the temperature danger zone for a certain period of time. And so we do our best to minimize that. And one of the things that we do is to only reheat leftovers once. All right, so that's one of the 4 things we control. We can control time and temperature. Next, we're going to talk about controlling personal hygiene. One of the things that we do to control personal hygiene, and that is required by law, is to shower or bathe regularly. And regularly could mean, to some people, it could mean monthly, it could mean weekly, but to us at CLV, regularly means daily. If you are going to be in the kitchen making food, you need to be clean. If you don't want to shower on your day off, that doesn't bother us a whole lot. Your coworkers might not like it too terribly when you're all sitting in the break room eating meals together. They have to smell you, but that, I guess, is your choice. But if you're working in the kitchen, we expect you to be bathed. Keep your fingernails trimmed. Fingernails are a great place for bacteria and dirt and germs to get, and so we want to keep those trimmed. Wear clean clothes and wear a proper head covering. Everybody has to wear something on their head in the kitchen that covers the crown of their head. Bandanas work great. Baseball caps work great. I've seen people wear like toques, winter hats. I think they're crazy, but they work just fine. Even bald people have to wear something in the kitchen. And the most important thing you can do for your own personal hygiene and to minimize danger to other people is wash your hands. And at orientation, we will go through the whole process of putting glow germ on your hands and making you wash your hands. And it's a whole lot of fun. So we've got time and temperature. We can control personal hygiene. Now we've got cleanliness and sanitation of work areas. And so there's 2 different types of cleaning. There's cleaning and there's sanitizing. Cleaning is removing the solid particles or particulates from a surface. And so if you take a paper towel and wipe off your counter at home and you get the food off the counter, that's called cleaning. In order for that counter to be sanitized, you have to use heat or some sort of chemical in order to kill those pathogens, kill those bacteria. This picture is an illustration of a lot of dirty pots and pans, but it's also an illustration of a really bad day in the kitchen. And so if 2 people call in sick, this might be what your dirty side looks like. Cleaning. Use a clean towel with soapy water to wash a surface. If you have to do some scrubbing, that's great. Do some scrubbing. And then you want to rinse that surface with clean water until there's no bubbles left. And so we talk about wash, rinse, and sanitize. So a wash and rinse is the cleaning part. Sanitizing is the other part. And if you can wash your table until there's no bubbles left, that's great. You don't have to rinse it. I just like finding Nemo. All right, cleanliness and sanitation of work areas. Sanitizing. So we talked about cleaning, which is the wash and rinse, and now we talk about the sanitizing. CLV uses 3 different methods to sanitize surfaces or anything in the kitchen. Heat, and this is done in the dish machine. The wash cycle of the dish machine must reach 150, and the rinse cycle must reach 180, again, because the dishes have to reach 171 degrees. Now, we can relate that back to washing hands. And so if you wanted to sanitize your hands using the hot water, that hot water would have to be at least 171 degrees. And your hands would have to reach that temperature in order for your skin to be sanitized. When you're washing your hands, it's more important that you can keep your hands under the water, scrubbing those things off, instead of that water being hot, because that water will never be hot enough to kill those germs. But back to sanitizing, we have 3 methods. We have heat, which is done in the dishwasher. Chlorine sanitizing solution. So 1 teaspoon of chlorine bleach to 1 gallon of water. So it's not a lot of chlorine bleach. In fact, I think it's very little. The goal is between 50 and 150 parts per million, and every kitchen has some test strips to check that. Generally, this is a backup in case you run out of sanitizing solution, but we do have a couple of kitchens that don't have the dispensers for sanitizing solution that will use bleach. Quaternary sanitizing solution is what we use in most of our kitchens. And this is taken right from the dispenser. So you stick your spray bottle or your bucket right into the dispenser and press the button and it magically comes out. Ecolab comes in once a month to make sure that those things are dispensing in the right ratio to calibrate them. But if you feel like something's wrong or it's not flowing quick enough, like it looks like, usually tell your chef and they'll take a look at it and see what it is. And counters are not clean if you wipe them with a napkin. They have to be sanitized. All right, so we can control time and temperature. We can control personal hygiene. We can control the cleanliness and sanitation of our work areas. And we can control cross-contamination. Cross-contamination occurs when microorganisms or those microbiological hazards are transferred from an infected source to food. Cross-contamination happens 2 ways. It happens through direct contact. So if you were to take some raw chicken, which is a TCS food or a time and temperature control for safety food, and if you were to take that raw chicken and stick it in the bucket of lettuce and rub it around a bunch, that's called direct contact, where the chicken is touching the lettuce. There's also indirect contact. So if you were to take your hand and pat that chicken and then go into the lettuce and root around for a little bit, that would be indirect contact because your hand is in between the TCS food and the food that is being infected. Preventing direct contact can be done a couple of different ways. We like to store TCS foods below non-TCS foods. So we're storing the dangerous foods below the non-dangerous foods. And this is because dangerous foods might leak or drip or in some way, some microscopic part of that dangerous food could get onto the food below it, therefore infecting that food. So if we, just to stick with chicken and lettuce, if we put raw chicken on the rack and we put lettuce right below it, and unbeknownst to us, some little tiny microscopic piece of bacteria goes from that chicken to that lettuce, we won't know about it, and then we'll take that lettuce and we'll serve it out as a salad, and somebody will get sick. So the chicken goes on the bottom, the lettuce goes on the top. And this goes in the order of those the trio of temperatures I talked to you about, 145, 155, and 165. So the non-dangerous food goes on the top shelf, and then we talk about the whole muscle meats, the fish, and the eggs at 145 go next, because if some pickling juice gets onto your beef, you're going to cook it to 145 degrees, and it's going to be fine. It's not a big deal. Pickling juice is not going to hurt the beef or pork, and it's not going to be dangerous. And if your whole muscle meats, if your pork loin drips a little bit of juice onto the ground beef below it, that's okay, because that ground or chopped meat gets cooked to 155, and that pork loin only needs to be cooked to 145. And so we've passed 145 and hit 155, and so that's safe. So we layer things in the cooler in the way that their temperatures are. Preventing indirect contact, we sanitize our cutting boards and all of our utensils. We sanitize all our work surfaces. We use separate utensils for things. And so the allergy, if you are making a vegetarian option or somebody's allergic to soy and you're at Chinese camp, you will have to use separate pans. You'll have to use separate utensils for those things that you don't want to get contaminated with whatever you're worried about contaminating it with. And most importantly, again, wash your hands between tasks, wash your hands when you come back from breaks, If your hands are not dry and cracked, you're probably not washing your hands enough. And that's a lot of information, and you'll get it all again this summer. But just remember the things that we can control are time and temperature, personal hygiene, how clean we keep our station, and cross-contamination. Whew. All right, last one. We're going to talk about chemical hazards, and we're going to talk about physical hazards, because we talked about the 3 types of hazards: microbiological, chemical, and physical. And all that those first 3 things, that was all about microbiological hazards. And so we spend all that time on it because it causes the most foodborne illness, and it's the hardest to prevent. Woo! We're 1/3 of the way done. We have covered microbiological. We're going to talk about physical and chemical. Physical hazards can take the form of food, such as peppercorns or bay leaves or nutshells or the stems of raisins or grapes. I mean, it's not gonna. Grape stems aren't gonna kill you, but they're certainly not nice to eat. Fruit pits, avocado pits, peach pits. Those are all foods that are considered physical contamination. If you've ever chomped down on a peppercorn, it doesn't feel very good. And so when you're using peppercorns, at least, you should use some cheesecloths so that they're easy to take out, because trying to find peppercorns in a tilt skillet that's filled with 5 gallons of stew is not a fun thing. Again, experience. Worms, insects, and dirt are also physical contaminants. Metal can chips, so when you're opening a tin can, be careful. Make sure no metal falls into the food that's in there. Staples can come out of boxes. Cardboard, everything's wrapped up in cardboard. Plastic wrap. Make sure that there's no plastic wrap in your leftovers when you unwrap them and serve them. Rat droppings, flies, cockroaches, so animals are also considered physical contamination. Woo! Now we're 2/3 of the way done, because we have 3 hazards: microbiological, physical, and chemical, and we are going to talk about chemical next. And the way we talk about chemical contamination is we say that we must assume that all foods are contaminated with some sort of chemical, whether it be fertilizers or pesticides, and so it must be washed. And that's it. That's chemical contamination. Wash your food. So a little short review, because that was a lot of information in the last 48 minutes. We have different types of foodborne illness: food infection, food intoxication, and food poisoning. And those come from the 3 types of hazards: microbiological, chemical, and physical. So that's kind of your baseline to start with. This is the long one where we talk about a whole bunch of stuff. We've got bacteria, viruses, parasites, and molds and yeasts. These are the 4 different types of microbiological hazards. And again, microbiological hazards are the thing that most commonly causes foodborne illnesses. These are the important temperatures that we want you to remember. We'll go through it again, and then we'll beat it into your head this summer too. Cooking temperatures: 145. We've got this trio. 145 is whole muscle meats, eggs, and fish. 155 is ground meats. 165, poultry, leftovers, and stuffed stuff. Those will come up every day as you are cooking in the kitchen. The things that we can control are time and temperature. Close the door on the cooler. Work in small batches. Use your thermometer when you're cooking stuff. We can control cross-contact or cross-contamination with proper storage. We can control personal hygiene with daily showering and washing of your hands. And we can control the cleanliness and sanitation of our work areas by washing, rinsing, and sanitizing them. Thawing, there's 4 legal ways to thaw food. There's one way that we want to do all the time, which is in the cooler. And the second most common one you'll see is submerged in the cold running water. And the other 2 we don't use very often at all. 3 ways to sanitize, one with heat, and that's important for your dishwasher. We need the wash cycle to reach 150. We need the rinse cycle to reach 180. Chlorine solution, 1 teaspoon of bleach per gallon of water, and with the quaternary solution that comes out of the dispenser in your kitchen. And now we're going to review the review just to make sure it's in your head. I'm kidding. If anybody has any questions, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask away, and I'll do my best. And if I don't know the answer, I will ask my boss because he knows all sorts of stuff. No questions? Everybody's got everything? We could do a quiz right now.
Double check, Mitch. Hang on. All right. If there are any questions, please feel free to unmute yourself. All right. It doesn't look like we have any questions. Thanks so much, Mitch. I know I learned a lot of interesting facts about food safety this evening. Appreciate you spending your time and sharing your expertise with us. And for our participants, thank you for joining us this evening and investing your own professional development for the summer. We look forward to seeing all of you at orientation in Bemidji, Minnesota in the coming weeks. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.
Brianna, do you have a question?
No.
The little hand was flashing next to Brianna, but it's not anymore. So,
Brianna, are you all right?
Yep.
No? Okay. All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a good night. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Kenji.
Thank you.